Welcome everyone to the conference. How will new trade relations and the global pandemic affect the globalization of the auto industry? We have some great speakers with us today to talk about this topic. I'm going to start off by talking about a little bit about the Automotive Futures Group and set the stage for our first speaker, Alan Deerdorf from the University of Michigan. Okay, so Automotive Futures Group. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the managing director of the Automotive Futures Group. We've been doing the conferences now for going on our 13th year. This is I think our 56th conference. We get our funding for our research from our affiliate program. We got supporting members and research partners, and we focus on globalization, advanced powertrains, and intelligent transportation systems, and as well as doing 5 annual conferences. Here's a list of our affiliate members. We appreciate all the support they give to us. If they were not doing this, we could not be putting on these conferences. We thank them very much. Our research partners come from our IT organizations, OEMs, government NGOs, as well as suppliers and consultants. When you look at the major projects that we're working on for 2020, our powertrain strategies for the 21st century, our new survey is going out in May, and we'll have the results in our conference in July. Our China New Energy Vehicle project is a continuing project that we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. We're also looking at the effects of autonomous vehicles on the economy, society, and the individual. When we started off 2020, we came up with some major research questions that we'd be looking at. And so much of this has changed within the last couple of months. When you look at how our auto manufacturers and suppliers are making themselves into mobility companies, well, you see something like GM with Maven shutting down the program. This is something that we've seen when you have major changes in the industry, something as drastic as a pandemic, you see things change. The other mobility one was how successful public-private partnerships will be in mobility as a service. In powertrains, what's the tipping point for EVs? And this is, we saw what happened just recently. I think it was yesterday when Ford, they didn't cancel the project for the Ford F-150 with Rivian, but I think they put it on hold. This is something that manufacturers do when money is tight, they go back to what they do the best. In terms of powertrains, is the dealership network prepared for mass EV sales and service? Also in powertrains, can OEMs use hybrids as a transitionary technology to EVs, or can they develop ICE vehicles that meet regulations until EV technology and infrastructure matures? We see something like this playing out with the changes that have already taken place within the government in terms of the CAFE regulations. And in terms of globalization, how long will it take manufacturers and suppliers to reconfigure their supply chains to meet the new NAFTA regulations, the USMCA regulations? Now, this is something that we'll be talking about today. Also, how much influence will China and the EU have on the acceleration of EV sales in the US? Well, again, this is something that's probably is going to be on hold for a little bit while we deal with the pandemic. For our researchers at Automotive Futures, we have Kara Elkire, who's online with us today. She's managing the Q&A session with us. Wei-Jen Li has worked with us on the conferences. Some of the data that I'll show you today is based on work that she's done. Rishi Chen and Aaron Melvani have been working on the China and global automotive electric vehicle industry project. Minori Suzuki's working on the autonomous vehicle project. Aaron Dahl is working on a U of M industry student survey. We have two ways that we've looked at that, one in 2013, one 2017. Daniel Nemmert's working on the powertrain strategy survey, and Alex Bald has been working on the U of M industry student survey, putting it into a Power BI, business intelligence format that we have on our website that you can see in automotivefutures.org. We also got a U of M School Alliance Consulting Group. This is a pro bono group that helps companies work on different projects. This year, we've had this business school group working with us on developing our affiliate program, as well as improving our conferences. And to that end, they've created a conference review, and there's a link that was sent to all of you about this that we ask that you send after the conference. Also, we've created a new LinkedIn page for making links within the university as well as the industry, and to try to get more things out in a more timely manner. Conferences coming up. We got Powertrain coming up in July. Future of Automotive IT in September. That's our 12th annual, and our 13th annual Inside China Conference coming up in November. We're not sure how many of these are going to be virtual, but we will see. So today we've got Alan Deerdorf, who's a professor, economics professor, who's joining us to talk about his view on the globalization overall, and looking at issues of globalization and the effects of the pandemic on the globalization. Jack Corporo from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's going to be talking about work that they have done on the USMCA, as well as some of the global trade issues that he's been following. Then we'll take about a 10-minute break and come back with Christian Dizek from the Center for Automotive Research. She's done a lot of work, especially in the USMCA, as well as labor issues and economics at the Center for Automotive Research. And Joe Zajac from the Original Equipment Supplier Association, OESA, which is the representative for all the automotive suppliers that are part of their group. And they've been pretty busy at working with the administration, making changes and making suggestions about how to open up the industry. At the end of the conference, everybody will get a link to all the PDF presentations, as well as links to the video presentations. Affiliates get the presentations, but they'll also get a summary overview and highlights of the conference. Any of the agenda, speaker bios, registration lists, sponsorship opportunities, affiliate information, upcoming events, all the things that we have in our in-person conferences, we will be having on our website. And we sent the link to the website on the live stream link that everybody just received. Audience questions, again, on the email that we sent you, there's a link to the Google form for asking questions during the conference, so please avail yourself of that. So when you look at the trade agreements that have been made recently, we look at USMCA, US-China, US-Korea, US-EU, and also other countries have not been quiet in terms of dealing with trade. EU and Canada, EU, Japan, and also the new comprehensive progressive trans-Pacific partnership. When you look at what's happening with USMCA, the final version or revised version was signed in December of last year. Again, of course, it replaces the NAFTA that took place and went into effect in 1994. Currently, the tariffs, the previous and NAFTA tariffs were exempt for if 62.5% of vehicles are made in Canada, Mexico, or the U.S. That jumps to 75%. Mexico also, auto industry is right now trying to seek a delay of the content rules, and hopefully Joe might be able to shed some light on that from the OESA perspective. Mexico is seeking to start at the beginning of 2021, but right now the administration has pushed it just to July 1st. The Boston Consulting Group came up with a little graphic here to show how things have changed from NAFTA to USMCA. And the big issue here, and something our speakers will be talking about, is the labor value content, which is something that's a little more challenging to talk about, which is why I'm going to leave it for them. We got a little bit on this. We're looking at how the U.S. Customs and Border Protection is going to be dealing with this. But we're also looking at what U.S. is doing with China. They've completed the phase 1 deal, which is signed in January. China will be buying more stuff from us in terms of manufacturing purchases, farm products and services. That includes motor vehicles, industry machinery, a lot of things that having to do with the auto industry. And from the US side, they'll cut by half the tariff rate it imposed in September on $120 billion list of Chinese goods to 7.5%. And the tariffs that were scheduled to go in effect in December on nearly $160 billion worth of Chinese goods were suspended indefinitely. For phase 2 negotiation, U.S. says that 25% on the tariffs on 25% of $250 billion worth of Chinese goods put in place earlier will remain immediately unchanged. These could be rolled back as part of phase 2 negotiation. For the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which went into effect in 2012, this is not new. It's been done. As I said, it's been going on since 2012. But the new version removes a few regulatory burdens for U.S. automakers to export cars. It extends 25% U.S. tariff on imported Korean trucks. It lifts a cap on U.S. car exports to South Korea that don't need to meet Korean safety standards, something that the Koreans and the Japanese have used to keep U.S. vehicles out of their country for many, 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 many years. In terms of standards, the U.S. also agreed to exempt South Korea from a new 25% tariff on global steel. Instead, South Korea accepted a quota to limit steel exports to the United States to 75% of what they were selling before. And also the 6-year-old trade deal has allowed both countries to sell more than $60 billion in cars, machinery, and goods, and to each other with few restrictions, making South Korea America's 6th largest trading partner. With the EU, it's a little different story. Not as things have not been as easy to do in terms of trade. The EU has their own issues that they want to work on. There's been a lot of trade tension since 2018 between the U.S. And the EU. U.S. imposed 25% and 10% on steel and aluminum, respectively, on imported EU steel on the basis of national security concerns, and the EU has retaliated. EU officials have said it would retaliate if Washington makes good on its threat to raise car tariffs. So auto-related trade currently accounts for 8% of total trade in goods between the EU and US. And the US is the 4th largest, biggest exporter of cars to the European Union. 19% of the total value of US car exports heads for the EU, representing 12% of EU imports of values. So there's something, the EU has something to talk about as well as the US when it comes to these negotiations. And the work that they were doing in the US also has a play for the EU in talking to the US, where they have made 3 million passenger cars in 2018, representing 25% of total US production. Now at the US plants, EU car makers provide jobs for 120,000 Americans and across the US. In Canada, Canada and the EU made their own trade agreement in 2016 after they saw that the US was going to go it alone in terms of doing their own trade. So the EU has now has tariffs on Canadian built vehicles, including 10% on automobiles. They'll be phased out over 7 years. The EU tariffs on 22% on light goods vehicles will be phased out over 3 years. 16% on mini buses carrying at least 10 people will be phased out over 5 years. and agreement will eliminate the EU's 4.5% tariff on Canadian-made auto parts, which is interesting because it depends on how do you define something made in Canada, because many of the global auto manufacturers also have plants in Canada that they could use to export to the EU. And also, Canada will dismantle import duties of 6.1% for automobiles over a period of 5 to 7 years. In the EU with Japan, Japan's been very busy because once they realized that the US was going to go it alone, they decided to make their own agreement, and in early 19, they did that with the EU, where the Japan agreement will remove EU tariffs on 10% on Japanese cars and 3% for most car parts. It'll scrap Japanese duties on some 30% of EU cheese and 15% of wines, as well as open up access for public tenders in Japan. And finally, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, which was signed, and it's in a revised version in 2019, and 11 countries signed this, all with coast along the Pacific Ocean, and they all are what one minister called a powerful signal against protectionism and trade wars. That's what this is an agreement that the U.S. backed out of when the Trump administration started, and they have been, and the rest of the group decided to continue to do it. Well, the good news was that they were able to get together, and what they have done represents 13% of the global economy. But if the U.S. had stayed in, it would have represented 40%. And the big goal for this was to, at the beginning, was to try to help and, or in some ways, force China to be a better global partner. There's a variety of things that goes across the automotive industry through the CPTPP, and you can see with Canada, but things phasing in and out depending on what their country is doing in terms of automotive, but it's usually phases out tariffs basically across Asia Pacific, as well as Mexico and Canada are also involved in this. So you can see here the tariff eliminations that go on, and it varies by how long it's going to take by country, and also by what they're planning to do in the near future. So that's all I have to do is kind of set up what was going on, what we'll be talking about today. As I say here, the links to the presentations and the videos will be emailed this weekend. So let's go to our first speaker, Alan Deerdorf. Alan, I'm going to unmute you here, and I'm going to do a quick introduction for Alan. He's a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. Received his PhD in economics from Cornell University in '71, and has been on the faculty of the University of Michigan since 1970. He has served as a consultant on many government agencies, including the Departments of State, Treasury, and Labor of the United States government, and international institutions, including the OECD and the World Bank. And he's published numerous articles on various aspects of international trade and trade theory and policy. Now, Professor Deerdorf's current research interests include potential implications of rules of origin in proliferating free trade agreements, the exemption of products from tariffs in FTAs, and the implications of recent trade policy changes and trade frictions between the United States and other countries. Professor Deerdorf, thank you for joining us. Please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Bruce. I loved and learned a lot from your introduction. You got a lot of details about all these different trade agreements and the tariffs and plans for getting rid of them that I had not looked at. So that's good to have. I'm going to have to go back and keep your slides for future purposes. Let me see if I can get this thing to There we go. Okay. What I want to talk about is intended to be pretty much background information for the rest of the conference today about globalization somewhat generally, recent trade policies that have come into effect, some for autos, but more generally as well. Then a little bit on the effects of the pandemic as it seems to have been playing out, and finally even a littler bit about the prospects for the future of trade policy. The first thing I'll mention here is that, and this was a bit of a surprise, and of course it didn't mean very much, but back in 2018, our president actually argued in favor of getting rid of all tariffs and barriers and subsidies. The EU was coming to visit and he was saying, let's get rid of everything. Did he mean it? I don't know, but he certainly didn't follow up on that by doing it. Instead, of course, what we saw was multiple rounds of tariffs on various things. And Bruce has already mentioned some of these. The first significant one and quite a change from what had come previously was the tariffs that he put on steel and aluminum. 25% tariffs on steel from just about every country initially, 10% tariffs on aluminum. These were put on with the justification of national security, though nobody could make a reasonable case for why tariffs on steel and aluminum from our allies should play any role in national security. Of course, this is extremely relevant for the auto industry because it uses as an input lots of steel and especially and also aluminum. And the effect of these tariffs, although Trump might have not accepted that it would be this effect, but it was to raise prices of steel and aluminum. Most of those tariffs are still in place on an awful lot of countries and continue to be quite relevant, although we've removed them now on several countries. Bruce mentioned that we got rid of them on Korea in return for their limiting their exports. They also were gotten rid of for Canada and Mexico, not actually as part of the renegotiated NAFTA, but as an inducement, I guess, for it to go through. The second thing that happened, of course, was the trade war with China. We put multiple rounds of tariffs on more and more products from China, and every time we did it, they responded on the same day with tariffs on our exports. That continued for several rounds all through 2018 and into 2019, reaching eventually that phase one agreement, which has been said to be a pause in it or a truce in it. But I would say it wasn't really. We only gave two things to China in return for that, and Bruce mentioned them both. One was cutting a few of our tariffs in half, a few of the new tariffs we had put on in half, and the second was to simply not raise tariffs on even more products as we had threatened to do. So it didn't by any means end the trade war with China. That is still very much in place. Trump threatened tariffs on automobiles from everybody, again on national security grounds, even though, again, that doesn't make much sense. That is still pending. He's got the authorization to do it from his own offices that did a report on it. And I haven't heard much about it lately, but as far as I know, he still views that as something that he could go ahead and do. And if he did it, others, Europeans certainly, but others as well would retaliate. An interesting thing that he did, not terribly relevant, well, yeah, actually it is relevant for autos, is it was very brief. Late last year, he threatened to put tariffs on all exports from Mexico. And I think the idea was it would be 5% on all exports, but then if they didn't do anything, it would rise to 10% after 1 month and so forth. And he threatened that that he would do that if they didn't take action to stop the migration from Central America through Mexico into the United States. And after just a few days, Mexico did make such a promise, and in fact, did change their policies in some ways. And so he didn't do that. It was an interesting example of the technique that President Trump seems to be using, certainly in trade policy and maybe in other areas, of threatening harm to others and to ourselves, although he is less likely to recognize the harm to ourselves, to try to get them to change their policies, to change their behavior. With Mexico, it seems to have worked. With Europe, I don't think it has worked. With China, not really. They promised to buy more of our exports of things. So I suppose you could say that it worked a little bit, but that seems to be the way he is running trade policy. Finally, I would mention that there are tariffs on the European Union. This is a much more limited thing, but it was in retaliation for the subsidies the EU applies to the Airbus company. The US has been found to provide subsidies to Boeing. That case is a little bit behind the other one, and so tariffs have not yet been put in place on the US because of that. I should probably say that although this has happened under Trump, this is the sort of thing that might well have happened under previous presidents as well. It was consistent with the negotiations and rulings of the World Trade Organization. Here's one picture of the trade war with China. With US tariffs in general, actually. It's showing down here at the very bottom the tariffs we put on solar panels and washing machines. The tariffs themselves were big, but the amount of trade that was covered was very small. Then there's the steel and aluminum tariffs, which were much more significant in terms of the amount of trade. And then time after time after time, we put tariffs on China. Let's see, other things that have happened. Most of these were touched on by, and actually explained quite well by Bruce, the amendment of the chorus of the trade agreement with Korea, which did a few things, one of which I mentioned here is the extension of our 25% tariffs on light trucks. The renegotiation of NAFTA, again, he mentioned that that's going to do two main things. It's going to require greater North American content in autos in order to qualify for exemption from tariffs when products cross the borders. And the second is a minimum value added. He alluded to this, said we'd explain it more. I'm not sure I can explain it too much more, but it was a new provision that has never showed up in any trade agreement previously, that in order to qualify for zero tariffs crossing the borders, the products in the auto sector needed to have a minimum percentage of value added put into them by labor earning more than $16 an hour. No labor in Mexico is ever going to earn that much. So that clearly is requiring greater labor input from the US and Canada. Exactly how that can ever be enforced or even known, I think, is not terribly clear, but some of the other speakers may have something to say about that. I mentioned just a couple of other things on this slide. The next one is perhaps not relevant to the auto industry, but we've been doing a war, the US has, with a particular company in China, the Huawei company that makes the most advanced 5G telecoms technologies. We have various reasons for doing that. It doesn't seem to be hurting them all that much. It probably is going to hurt the United States because we're going to have to rely on less advanced technologies for the new 5G telecoms if we don't buy from Huawei, because they are the leader in this. And then finally, I have to mention that Trump has taken actions to block appointments to what's called the Dispute Settlement Appellate Body at the World Trade Organization. And as of December of 2019, he had blocked enough of those appointments that body no longer has a quorum, and it is not able to finalize any processes in the WTO. So the WTO has a very important part of it has simply been killed or put into a coma. It's unable to function until something changes on that. Whether that's going to be relevant for the auto industry, I'm not sure, but it certainly is relevant in other areas. Trade actions by others, well, of course, lots of trade agreements Bruce mentioned, and that's important. But the main thing relevant to us most directly is that they have responded with retaliatory tariffs. by many countries, and we basically had a trade war leading to that phase one truce that I mentioned, but that doesn't mean, I think, a great deal. Here is a chart showing the retaliatory tariffs that have been put on by not just China, but other countries. You notice compared to the previous chart that the thing doesn't go up as far. That's because we don't export nearly as much as we import. So when they put tariffs on, they're not putting it on as much trade as we can put it on when we put tariffs on imports. Here's a chart showing what the tariffs did in both directions with China, and basically they went up, and now as of the end of this graph anyway, the increases had reached about the same level. Turning now to the effects of the pandemic, and I may be going faster than I had expected to. There have been all sorts of effects, and I've listed a bunch of them there, and I will have a few things to say about each of them, I think, but not a lot to say. Much of this, of course, isn't directly relevant to the auto industry, but it's going to have indirect effects, I'm quite sure. On travel, this is something that as a train economist, even though I have participated in it by traveling myself a great deal, I'd never paid that much attention to it as a form of international trade. But my goodness, of course, it has plummeted. Here's a chart showing the number of people going through the TSA checkpoints in March of this year and March of the previous year. And of course, it's gone down close to zero. So a huge effect on travel. And that's had adverse effects, of course, on the stock prices of the airlines, which this just shows, I think, all the various American airlines and how much their stock prices went down. I've noticed, as I'm sure many here have, stock prices have been going up since this chart ended, since the well, I don't know, over the last month or so. They haven't gotten back to their original levels, but I think if this chart had gone further in time, it would show some pickup. Stock markets generally, again, declined, although I think they have been coming back up again, but not back to their original levels. And this is not just in the United States. This shows a bunch of different countries where stock prices have gone down from February to March of this year. Much more important for the auto industry, of course, I mean, stock prices are important too, but is factories have been shut down. And here is a chart that I found in Automotive News. It's more than a month old. This was showing, I think actually, maybe it is not a month old, although that's what I said I got the source from. It shows the states where assembly plants had been closed as of April. Oh, I'm sorry, no, as of March 25th. And then they were reporting when they plan to restart. And as of that date, Ford and GM had no plans to reopen any of their US assembly plants. Fiat Chrysler had said they would reopen them sometime after May 3rd, but they didn't say when. For other companies, that was not the case. Already they were talking about when they would open up. And in fact, there was one plant, I've forgotten now which company it was, but it was European, I believe. Well, maybe not. Anyway, a plant in Georgia opened up on the 13th of April, and many others, and I'm showing the dates here, had by then announced that they were going to open, most of them sometime in early May. As of that date, none of the US companies were predicting anything that precise. I did see just yesterday in the news that all three American companies, is Fiat Chrysler American? Well, anyway, we're targeting May 18th now to resume limited production. That was in the Wall Street Journal. What's this doing to car production? Well, it's dropped, obviously, a great deal. It dropped first in China because they had the pandemic first, and it recovered first in China. And obviously, a lot of this is forecasts. This chart was from, well, it was in The Economist. I think it's in The Economist this week, actually. If you read The Economist, this week's issue has a whole section, actually two sections, on the auto industry and what the pandemic is doing to it. So I only obviously found that after I had made most of these slides, but I added this one to it with their forecast of what's going to be happening to car production, the percent change on a year earlier. Notice, of course, what is this? There's the zero line. So even before the pandemic, car production was down in almost every place. It looks like it wasn't down in Japan and South Korea, but for everybody else, it was. But it was down just a little bit. And of course, now it's plummeted in all of them. The same Economist article from this week talks about the different companies and how vulnerable they are to all of this. And what this chart shows is how much liquidity they have, which I guess is an indication of how long they can last if they are producing nothing. And this is showing in the months of liquidity. So BMW had apparently enough money to last for a year before running out. Fiat Chrysler, only 3 months. And you see, of course, GM, Ford, and Fiat Chrysler are near the bottom of this list. So if the thing were to go on much longer, you can see clearly in addition to what it simply does to their profits, they are presumably going to run risks of something more drastic, bankruptcy or something, if they don't get bailout money from the government. This does not, as far as I know, take into account anything like such bailout monies that they might get. Oh, the reason for the heading, I just read this morning. I finally read the whole article. There's call now in Europe for a cash for clunkers policy to be used there, similarly to what was done after the financial crisis when the auto sector was hurt badly. What about the supply chains? Well, you know, of course, that the supply chains cross the borders multiple times, especially in North America, where the NAFTA is. But I was directed maybe now it was a couple of years ago, to a series of maps here illustrating this. I like to show this to my students when I'm teaching, which I'm not right now. But anyway, this was from the source mentioned down there. It shows some little capacitor that comes in from Asia and first goes to some place in Colorado. What's done with it there, I'm not exactly sure, but it then gets shipped to Mexico, where it is assembled into a circuit board, which for some reason is shipped back across the border again to El Paso to go into a warehouse, but then sent back into Mexico again to be attached to an automatic seat control, which then finally is shipped both to the US and to Canada to be attached to the seats, which I suppose don't get shipped too much further before they are put into cars. So the point is, that's just one example, but there's huge numbers of them, not just in the auto sector, but in many, of parts that if you start out with them somewhere in the world, they come to the US and then they cross those borders between the US and Canada and Mexico time after time after time. If we didn't have NAFTA or USMCA, every time they cross those borders, they'd be paying a tariff. So that would accumulate and the costs would go up and up and up. And that's, of course, what NAFTA and the USMCA, to the extent that they apply, stop. They get rid of those extra costs that are levied in tariffs every time the things cross the border. But they only do that. Oh, and I should say, in most of this stuff, the tariff is only 2.5%. That doesn't sound like much, but when you do it multiple times, it accumulates and makes cars more expensive, not just for sale in the United States to US consumers, but for sale abroad. It makes it more expensive for the US companies, or those operating in the US, I should say, not just the US companies, to sell their products in other countries in competition with production abroad that doesn't suffer these extra costs. So the NAFTA was a huge policy change that encouraged this growth of the supply chains back and forth within North America, and the rules of origin, it was 62.5, it's now 75% requirement of value added from North America, and this high wage requirement, both, to the extent that they are binding, are going to raise costs. Either the firms will have to change where they buy the product in order to satisfy the requirement, or they will have to start paying the tariff on things they wouldn't have paid before. So it's going to increase the costs for the auto producers. Oh yeah, there's where they are going to. What are the effects of these supply chains? Well, it's incredibly complicated. And aside from giving a little example, as I just did, I don't have anything very clear that's going to illustrate it. There was a couple months ago this pair of charts in The Economist magazine that tried to get at this a little bit. On the left, they tried to categorize industries by how vulnerable they are to cutting of the global supply chain. And different industries differed in a couple of dimensions. One is how much inventories do they have? If an industry has lots of inventories, then they can survive better if the supply chain is cut. And that's the horizontal one. And the vertical one is the number of alternative sources they have for the products that they purchase, the inputs that they use to their production. And they categorized industries in here. The automotive industry is there. As you see, it is fairly far to the right in terms of the size of inventories, and kind of intermediate in risk in terms of the number of alternative sources. They then use these data to categorize industries in just two ways. How vulnerable are they to China, and how vulnerable are they not to China? I don't know where they put the auto industry, but I would suspect it probably was in the not terribly high exposed, judging from what's on the left here. But then they looked at what happened to the share prices of these companies, and you see, as you would expect, that the more vulnerable industries suffered a greater drop in their stock prices when the pandemic started. What's happened to trade? Well, if trade has dropped, I will mention that in a minute. One of the things that many of us are concerned about, this is not as directly relevant for the auto sector as for just all of us, is the trade in personal protective equipment. And the fact is that an awful lot of it comes from China. That's what this is telling us here, that the share of imports from China of personal protective equipment is something like twice as large, not just for us, but for the EU and others, as it is for all other countries, making us, and this was of course more relevant back when China was shutting down, much more vulnerable to a reduction in exports from China. Interestingly, when Chinese exports did decline, and they certainly did as a result of their own epidemic, their exports of personal protective equipment dropped, yes, but dropped by less than everything else. I don't know what that tells us really, except that certainly China was not deliberately favoring their own purchasers of PPE more than all the other products. Indeed, they cut back their exports less than they did of other things, which is a bit surprising, perhaps. Turning now to unemployment, we know, of course, that unemployment went up. For a person who's been looking at and showing my students graphs of the unemployment rate over time, my entire career, this one is just astonishing. I mean, if it weren't for this recent thing, we'd have changed the scale, and you'd see the bumps in the 2001 and 2008 recessions as looking pretty dramatic. But then you look what happened in 2020, and of course, is just an order of magnitude larger than what we'd ever seen before. This shows the same changes in somewhat more detail. Turning now to the overall output of the economy as a result of the pandemic. Well, this is what's expected, I should say, to happen to the world economy, to world GDP. This came out from the International Monetary Fund about 2 weeks ago. And you see here what actually did happen to world GDP. And in this history, this goes back all the way to 1980 with quarterly numbers. There was only one time that world GDP fell at all, and it fell by a very small fraction of 1%. And generally speaking, world GDP has been rising at around 3% in most years, more some, less in others. Well, what's happening now? Well, the truth is we really don't know. This report from the IMF was introduced by their chief economist as being incredibly uncertain. We've never experienced anything like what we're experiencing right now. So this is a wild, wild guess. But they are quite convinced it's going to drop, and it's going to drop much, much more than it ever has before in recent history. Now, they also are expecting that it's going to come back with a vengeance after the pandemic is over. Of course, they seem to be assuming that the pandemic will, in fact, end, and much more than I think I feel as confident, but then what do I know? Anyway, this thing is really big for world GDP, and therefore it's going to be really big for the demand for automobiles in the entire world, which is going to matter for this sector. Shortages. Here was a chart I happened to find from somewhere, Bloomberg News, of the shortages of auto component imports. Now, this was back when it was just China that was having the epidemic and had shut down a lot of their factories, and they're showing how vulnerable different countries were to this cutting of the supply chain. That was quite specific to the fact that it was only China that it shut down. Today, it's not clear. I mean, all of the links of the supply chains are now being impacted, and it's not clear that any particular country's source is that much more important. Is there a shortage of auto parts? I suppose there is. I looked for charts or pictures of that, and this is the best I could find, and I don't know what to expect to see in the parts department at the Village Ford in Dearborn. But I guess the point is that those shelves are not quite as full as they normally would be. There's a bunch of headlines, which I managed to find, showing talking about shortages of auto parts, although the most recent one I found in Bloomberg was that there's going to be a rebound. And China's rebound now is itself facing a risk of parts shortages, presumably to some extent coming from other countries. Well, okay, I did get done a shade earlier than I think I was told to. But anyway, I'm open now for questions.
Thank you very much, Alan. Hold on one second.
Sure.
Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, okay. Yep.
Okay. And let me turn everybody else back on. And okay. All right. So we got everybody back online here. Thanks again, Alan, for the overview on what you see happening in relationship to globalization and the pandemic. Now, when you look at what we've been looking at in terms of globalization, we're going back 30 years now for NAFTA. When you start looking at the goals of globalization as they were implemented 30 years ago, have the goals been met?
Well, one goal was to increase trade, and it certainly did. The trade in the NAFTA countries grew far, far more actually than my colleagues and I when we were doing anticipatory studies of the NAFTA than we predicted, because we didn't anticipate the effects that the NAFTA would have on investment across the borders, and that of course was necessary for the growth of the supply chains. Indeed, in our models, we didn't have the auto sector having supply chains in anything like this extent, because before NAFTA, they just weren't importing nearly as many parts as they do now. So we missed that. Trade grew far more than was expected, but that was considered the objective, I'm sure, of NAFTA. So that was as expected. There was one aspect of it that we hoped for and expected, and it didn't occur, and that was the hope was that the NAFTA would raise incomes and wages in Mexico sufficiently that the pressure for migration from Mexico to the United States would ease. Well, the pressure for migration from Mexico did eventually ease, but not because of a rise in their wages. And migration continued through Mexico for other reasons unrelated to NAFTA. But the wages didn't go up. And that's very disappointing, and I don't think we really understand that. The other thing that happened was, I don't know whether it's to say it was anticipated or not, we all knew that NAFTA was going to have costs. There were going to be portions of all three economies that would be hurt by it at the same time that other parts were being helped. One that we knew about was the agricultural producers, the farmers in Mexico. When they had to compete with American farms, they were going to be hurt, and they were, and they did. And a lot of people had to leave the land and move to the cities, for example. We knew that was going to happen. It was unfortunate, and I don't know whether Mexico dealt with it very well. I suspect not. We also knew that there was going to be dislocation of American labor, that some factories in the US would shut down. For those old enough to remember, of course, in the debate 30 years ago about the NAFTA, Ross Perot, who was running for president as a third-party candidate, was predicting a great sucking sound as businesses moved to Mexico. The sound did not occur. The movement didn't occur in anything like the dramatic level that Ross Perot predicted, but there certainly was some movement, and factories did shut down at the same time that other factories expanded. And those factories that did shut down did cause dislocation for their workers and for the communities in which they were located if the communities supported only maybe one factory. So that the costs of it were expected. I think those of us who studied it were expecting that the US labor market could accommodate that, and I think it pretty much did. The losses of jobs due to NAFTA were actually tiny compared to the losses of jobs that take place all the time in the churning of the US labor market. And so they were not, in fact, terribly harmful, but that wasn't the way it was looked at by those who were focused on the particular places where the jobs were lost. So the antipathy to globalization and to international trade, I think, grew in the general public to some extent, more than it would have otherwise because of NAFTA. And that antipathy to globalization, of course, we've been seeing more and more in recent years. Now, it grew a lot faster, I think, and more recently due to the increased trade with China. After China was entered into the World Trade Organization, their exports to the United States grew, again, far, far more than I think anybody expected. And for, to some extent, similar reasons. Lots of investment took place in China once it was known that they could not be, we thought, subject to higher tariffs. We didn't know Trump would come along. And so, to some extent, I would say the NAFTA had an adverse effect on the public perceptions of the desirability of trade and of globalization. I think those are the main effects that I think of, but I'd be glad to hear what other members of our panel might say about that.
Anybody want to jump in?
I will, if you don't mind. One of the things that gets portrayed about NAFTA is, the trade agreement itself caused there to be a loss of jobs, especially in the auto sector. And, then you have a bevy of research that said it was automation. No, it was trade. It's both, and a bunch of other things. I think the erosion of labor power in bargaining has led to this as well. If you take, a factory in 1979, peak UAW membership, the people who swept the floor, did sequencing and kitting, all of those jobs were UAW auto jobs. So they would be captured in the government data for an automotive sector job. And because over time, the bargaining has led to many of those jobs being outside. They're in the service sector now. They're, a company that comes in and does the cleaning. Another company comes in and does sequencing and kitting. Lots of temporary workers as well that also show up in the service sector as team assemblers in service sector. So there's just been an erosion of jobs that are counted as automotive jobs in the government statistics. And in addition to technology, we've adopted things like the Toyota production system that just allow greater productivity to happen without, it's enabled by automation, but it can happen without automation. So there's all these different factors going on that cause there to be fewer jobs, greater productivity in the auto sector. It's not just trade or technology, which is the traditional fight that is talked about.
I know went from the China story was always been an interesting one because when you look at the trade with China, there's and the effects of globalization with China, you look at some things that happen with China at the turn of the century, the introduction of China into the WTO and the growth of the Chinese market, so that companies were going to China not only to sometimes export back to the US, but they were going to China to sell in China. It's the largest market in the world by a lot now. And even though things are going, who knows how they end up, things are going to end up this year, but still, this is something that has taken place since the turn of the century. And we're looking at the two different angles, I think, for China in terms of trade. It was so companies are leaving. Well, companies are actually establishing sometimes to export as well as to service which is something, service the Chinese market, something that did not happen in Mexico. Anybody else on that question?
Well, I think another interesting point about the China, Professor Deardorff showed the slides about exposure to China and that was a bigger risk. And now that China seems to be beyond the initial outbreak of COVID-19, exposure to China might be a positive to some of the companies that are there. As the Chinese market is recovering, it was a sharp recovery at first, but it started to slow down. But it still may be eventually a positive because they have lower vehicle ownership, they have more headroom to grow as people move from public transit to personal vehicle ownership. And so it's, what was in January a negative may in turn to be a positive if their market recovers more strongly than others.
Now, Professor Deardorff, one of the things that we hear a lot about, and I think this is something that we'll probably be talking about throughout our conversation here, is globalization really just regionalization? Has it transformed to areas of the world that they tend to use local trade agreements, such as NAFTA, or the EU incorporating the Eastern Europe and Central Europe into the Western Europe, what would you call it, sphere of influence, as well as the Asia Pacific group that has very, very much trade amongst those countries. And as a way of dealing with having to deal with really long supply lines, say from China to the US or the EU to the US, do you see a lot of companies in general just looking regionally to maximize, to really make their supply chains more effective?
Well, I mean, it's always been true that distance matters in trade. And indeed, it's one of the strongest empirical relationships you can find in economics, is the systematic relationship between the amount of trade between two countries and their distance from each other, as well as their size, which obviously matters just as well. And that role has always been true. I think it is fair to say that the role of distance has been declining over time because the cost of transportation has been going down over the long, decades. And so trade really is global. Now, you're right that trade agreements tend to start within a region. I mean, NAFTA obviously was a great example of that, and the European Union another one. In South America, although it's not as effective, there's the Mercosur agreement amongst a group of countries there. But even those agreements, or not those agreements, but those countries have moved to a broader view of what their region is. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was all about trade across the Pacific Ocean, and that's a pretty big distance. Now, it's a distance across a part of the globe, which is a lot cheaper to move heavy stuff across than across land, which I'm sure is important for that. That's the reason why it was a Trans-Pacific partnership, not a partnership between Western Europe and Asia, where they would have to move everything along the Silk Road or something like that. But nonetheless, the trade agreements have been expanding their geographic scope. And of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership went ahead without the United States and would have gone ahead with the United States if it weren't for Trump. It's also true that countries are not only negotiating trade agreements with their neighbors. I mean, we have them with Australia and New Zealand, which couldn't be further away, and the Europeans do the same sort of thing. Yes, there is, in particular companies obviously are going to take account of distance and the costs of moving the stuff from their trading partners to here, and that matters a lot for the products. But I gather for the auto sector, an awful lot of the parts start out pretty small. Eventually, they get to be the size of a car door or something, and then you're not going to move them as far, I guess. But I think distance matters a whole lot less for an awful lot of the things even that go into automobiles.
Anybody want to talk about anyone else want to weigh in on the regionalization story?
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. From the supply side, we've seen the extent of regionalization. I mean, it's perfectly exemplified here in North America, but what we're starting to see is our members are investing in the rest of Asia to support the Chinese market, and they're really capitalizing on these smaller underdeveloped economies, developing scale there, and then importing them into China for ultimate vehicle production. And then at the same time, you see the same thing in Europe, and they're leveraging the former Soviet states, as well as to a smaller extent Middle East and Africa.
Very good. Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Professor Deerdorf. We're gonna move on to our next speaker, Jack Caporo. As I said, Jack is a associate fellow at the International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His research focuses on policy areas related to trade, international economic policy, digital trade, innovation, and new technologies. Before joining the center, he was associate editor for Inside U.S. Trade, the premier organization for international trade news. There, his work focused on U.S.-China trade relationship, the TTP, NAFTA, dispute settlement and negotiations at the WTO, and the Trump administration's trade policy agenda. Jack, thanks for joining us. I'm gonna mute everybody else, and you can start sharing your screen and telling your story.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. So I wanted to hold my ammunition on the regionalization question because I'm actually going to be talking about it a little bit today, and there will be some overlap with my comments and the previous two speakers' comments. So I apologize for that, but I think hopefully the conclusions will be at least a little interesting. So I'm gonna, a quick overview of the U.S. trade agenda, and I think as I get into the presentation, it's important to remember what the objectives of the Trump administration really are. And the president's favorite word when he talks about trade is reciprocity. He feels as though the United States has been ripped off, and it's his job to seek fair, reciprocal, balanced outcomes that ensure that U.S. exporters have the same opportunities as foreign exporters that are seeking to get their product into U.S. markets. Second objective, I think, obviously, is to reshore supply chains to bring more production back to the United States. And then his third objective, although less explicitly stated, but definitely comes through in some of the policy that the administration has carried out that maybe doesn't make as much headline news, is he really wants to protect the United States innovative edge, and he does that through a number of the cross-cutting tools. And so where is the administration and its trade agenda? They've concluded 2 agreements, USMCA yet to come into force in Korea. They've got a bunch of agreements that are in progress, kind of in limbo or stuck. So the UK-US agreement has kind of been in limbo for a while, and now, it's not clear when they'll be able to actually kick off negotiations because of the pandemic. The negotiations with the European Union have been stuck over scoping issues since the 2018 joint statement between Presidents Trump and Jan-Claude Juncker when he came to town. And then they have announced an intent to negotiate a free trade agreement with Kenya. And the earliest that those negotiations could start would be later this summer. But again, it's not clear when they'll actually get off the ground. There's unfinished business, obviously, with Japan and China. I wouldn't put too much stock in a quick conclusion to phase 2 of either of those agreements for reasons that I can get to a little bit later. And then there are some cross-cutting issues that I think are important, ongoing, and unresolved. So the first category I would put into the technology control bucket, and that includes export controls and ongoing efforts. The ongoing process to upgrade the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which screens foreign investment coming into the United States, and the effort to implement FIRMA, which upgrades and modernizes the committee's work. The administration is also working on export controls in areas beyond Huawei and 5G technology, areas that get into the automotive industry quite a bit, like navigational equipment, autonomous systems, etc. And the outcome of those rules on those types of technologies could limit not only U.S. ability to export, physical products, components that relate to those technologies, but also could limit movement of people who have knowledge about those technologies and change the foreign direct investment situation into the US for companies that are seeking to partner with US companies or establish operations in the US that deal with some of those emerging technologies. Of particular consequence here is how the United States is applying some of these rules to China, which I can get to a little bit later as well. Obviously, the steel and aluminum 232 tariffs remain, and the threat of auto tariffs has not completely gone away. As Professor Deerdorf mentioned, the WTO is in not great shape. The dispute settlement function has been hamstrung, I would say, or put on pause for the time being, and the negotiating arm of the WTO hasn't produced much in about 20 years now. And so there are big question marks about, what the proper forum is for multilateral global trade negotiations going forward, whether that phase of, big global trade agreements has come to an end, and kind of as a fundamental feature of the trading system. As a result, we'll move into a more regionalized approach to trade negotiations, given the WTO's inability to properly function. And then finally, we have the US, EU, and Japan trilateral efforts, which are really focused on confronting non-market economic practices coming out of China. And it's a platform for these 3 countries to negotiate new rules on subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and technology transfer. And there's the question that I have and that I think about quite often is whether or not this type of cooperation, it's a little bit more ad hoc, group of like-minded countries that seek to upgrade specific WTO rules, whether that type of cooperation will be what we see more often moving forward, because of difficulties at the WTO and difficulties in really negotiating really large trade agreements that include a lot of different partners. So U.S.-China trade relationship here on the right, we have just U.S. Auto exports and U.S. part exports to China. Obviously, there's a imbalance in both areas. We import a lot more parts to China than they import from us, and we send them a lot more automobiles than they send to us. You can see in 2018 there was a dip, as well as 2019 relative to 2017, which may have something to do with the trade war, which is ongoing. I would note, the other way that I think about the Trump administration's trade policy, and particularly as it deals with automobiles, is that there's a spectrum which I have a slide on later, of really extreme managed trade and pretty standard, trade liberalization that's negotiated with its partners. And with the U.S.-China arrangement, you have managed trade to the extreme, right? So the phase one agreement includes purchasing commitments, which Bruce talked about, 78 billion of which have to do with manufactured goods, which includes automobiles. The line, number for, what value of automobiles China has to purchase to fulfill their commitments hasn't been made and won't be made public because both sides didn't want to create market distortions that could be, or didn't want to create a situation where companies could exploit market distortions, et cetera. But basically, you now have a situation where I think the trust that was established and the economic goodwill that was established after January phase one agreement has kind of disappeared. So the coronavirus, I think, would have been a good opportunity for the two countries to come together and cooperate on a global issue. Instead, they're kind of trading blame with each other and trading barbs with each other, and it's added another level of mistrust to a relationship that's already fraying on a whole range of issues. And it's also created an global economic situation that calls into question whether China can meet its phase one purchasing commitments. And the agreement doesn't leave very many outs for when there's a disagreement. It escalates pretty quickly into one country or the other having the opportunity to just withdraw from the agreement if they feel as though it's not being implemented as agreed to. So the stakes are really high, particularly given that China is the most lucrative market for automobile sales, but the options are so limited because the relationship has been strained, and the agreement itself doesn't offer very many outs. So in this instance, I would say that regionalization is the name of the game. I don't think that the prevailing U.S. strategy will be to build to export to China. That being said, the joint venture requirements in China and concerns about intellectual property theft and technology transfer raises questions about how appetizing it is for a U.S. company to say we're going to set up in China or partner with companies in China solely for the purpose of exporting to China or serving, and so there, it might be worthwhile to look at RCEP rules, which are set to come in either later this year or next year as a way to serve China from the region, which again trends with the overall regionalization dynamic. U.S. Korea, as Bruce already noted in his overview, there was some outcome on U.S. exports of vehicles that met U.S. safety standards was lifted from 25,000 to 50,000, which is really a limited impact because in 2019 we exported a total of 57,000 automobiles to Korea, and you can see this top chart. The agreement itself didn't have really any impact in 2019. This outcome was the least managed outcome between Korea, China, and USMCA. US-Japan, so automobiles were left for a phase two agreement. We'll see if the Trump administration gets around to that and how quickly they can close that agreement. They've left basically all of the really difficult issues for last and resolved, I think, a lot of really low-hanging fruit. And so it's an interesting negotiating strategy because they've essentially resolved all of the easy things that one could give away to grease the wheels on some of the harder issues. Japan, their approach I think also fits into the regionalization trend. So the U.S. withdrew from TPP, and instead of kind of following the U.S. lead and going on its own, Japan doubled down, pursued CPTPP, really led its entry into force, and now they're recruiting or really looking at bringing new members on board into CPTPP, in part because of their experience with the pandemic and the early outbreak in China disrupting supply chains across a lot of industries. Their reaction after that was to double down on CPTPP and expand its membership to create a buffer from its reliance on China. Just from auto supply chain perspective, it's an interesting case because Japan had a relatively low case count early on, but still experienced automobile plant closures in large part because of supply chain disruptions, not because they were necessarily sending people home from work like we're doing in the United States. And so I think the lesson there is that the pandemic, has revealed that disruptions can occur across stages. So you have supplier and supply uncertainty, there's process uncertainty, and then there's massive demand uncertainty, and that can all add up into cascading disruptions, which can really affect business operations, particularly in the automobile sector. So USMCA, this was an agreement that the program that I work with at CSIS, we did a lot of work on last year, and we particularly looked at the automobile rules of origin as a case study for how rules of origin could be implemented and used to further economic objectives in other agreements. And I think that rules of origin will play a larger role in trade agreements that are negotiated by this administration and potentially by future administrations that share similar objectives and feel as though the United States and its trade arrangements hasn't necessarily gotten a fair deal. And I would just point to recent comments by U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer about USMCA and its July 1, the announcement that it would enter into force on July 1. And he said the crisis and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates that now more than ever, the United States should strive to increase manufacturing capacity and investment in North America. The USMCA's entry into force is a landmark achievement in that effort. So I think he views USMCA and the rules of origin as a way to protect the the North American automobile supply chain and protect and insulate U.S. auto production, auto jobs from global forces and global supply chain disruptions. And so, his comments come even though auto groups and a bipartisan group of lawmakers have asked the administration to delay entry into force because of, one, the complexity of the rules, which Bruce and the professor talked about, plus the complexities of the supply chain and disruption caused by COVID. And so the news recently is that on July 1st, the three countries have agreed that the agreement will enter into force, and that is the day that regulations for implementing the automotive rules of origin must be issued. There are still a lot of outstanding question marks, particularly how the rules of origin, which will be the most stringent and complex automotive rules of origin in any trade agreement, how those rules of origin will actually be implemented, whether or not U.S. producers will qualify for these, extension program, 2-year extensions that will help them comply with the rules. Basically, how USTR is, judging or approving those extension plans is up in the air. And then, the other really big question mark is how the labor value content requirement will be tracked. And so implications, again, it's important to recognize the administration's goal was to increase automobile and parts production in the United States. And based on the research that we did, as well as the economic analysis done by the US ITC, International Trade Commission, as well as some other international bodies, the rules will likely result in a short-term cost as companies have to reconfigure their supply chains in order to meet the more stringent rules. It will probably result in some long-term investment in the United States in things like assembly and core part production, which includes the larger parts like engines and gearboxes, etc. But overall, the costs that come with compliance will weaken the U.S. Auto industry's global position, right? So vehicle costs will increase, which will increase the cost of exports, and essentially the competitive picture for the United States globally will decline, while its regional position may become a little bit stronger. And so that's a trade-off that the administration, I imagine, is willing to take. The other conclusion we came to from our study of the issue is that home field advantage helps. So the companies that have been operating in the United States the longest will tend to have an easier job complying with the rules. And finally, just uncertainty abound about implementation and how exactly companies throughout the supply chain, whether it's an OEM or a tier 1 or tier 2 supplier, uncertainty about the how they'll comply with the rules and the process in which compliance will be determined. And I think, as everybody knows, uncertainty can generate costs throughout throughout the supply chain. So here, turning to COVID, and to kind of tie it all together, there have been two trade responses to COVID, right? So one has been a kind of gut reaction towards self-sufficiency, reshore supply chains, et cetera, and as a way of building resiliency for this crisis and also for future crises. And the other response has been to supply chains, right? So you don't want to be reliant on any one country for any one individual part. So if that country goes offline, you have a supply chain problem. But I think the actual more meaningful question that businesses and governments will have to grapple with after the crisis is efficiency versus resiliency, right? And so I think the name of the game it has been efficiency for a long time. How do you maximize, value in the short term, and how do you maximize revenue in the short term? And that drive for efficiency is what's generated global value chains that stretch around the world. And now I think you'll get a second look at resiliency through regionalization and resiliency through self-sufficiency, which will obviously generate short-term costs, but maybe be more sustainable longer term. And I think here, government policy can have an impact. So I think rules of origin are a really clear example of government policy. The USMCA rules of origin are a really clear example of government policy that tries to build in a regional approach. Essentially, it really strongly encourages a regional approach. And whether or not that creates a type of resiliency necessary to respond to future crises, I think remains to be seen. But essentially, it wouldn't surprise me if the USMCA rules of origin approach is replicated in future agreements with this objective in mind. So, the other question about regionalization that I ask quite a bit is whether this is a new trend or an existing trend, and in other words, whether the pandemic puts the global economy on a new path towards regionalization, or whether or not it simply is accelerating existing trend. And I think it is more accelerating an existing trend. So, there are four factors in my mind that are most influential. So population growth, the fastest growing part of the world is the Asia Pacific, and it's also the region that is home to the most regional trade agreements according to the World Trade Organization. It's where the majority of the EU's trade agreements under negotiation are taking place. It's home to two mega regional trade agreements, CPTPP and RCEP, and that's not a coincidence. Second is the Asia Pacific is also home to the fastest growing part of the global middle class, which is what This chart here on the right shows where global middle class consumption is taking place, and you can see East Asia and the Pacific and South Asia are projected to dominate there. Third, sustainability and concerns about climate change drive regionalization in my mind for two reasons. One, you can cut down on your carbon footprint by shrinking your supply chains, and the most efficient way to do that is to take a regional approach. And second, as climate change accelerates, the risks of having a really long, drawn-out supply chain increase as extreme weather events become more likely and occur on a more regular basis. And so one way to protect against those types of events and reduce risk, mitigate risk, is to shrink your supply chains and make them shorter. And then third is technology and the impact that technology has on reducing labor costs. And so, I think the pandemic will accelerate trends towards automation because, robots can't get sick and you don't have to worry about a pandemic. You don't have to send your robot home if there's a pandemic. But along with automation becomes less of a premium placed on cheap labor. And so I think that also will allow for more regionalization to occur. And so what does that mean for US trade policy? I mean, there's a spectrum to choose from, whether it's the most managed or least managed, which is TPP over here on the right. And I think, as a result of the pandemic, the scales, at least in the short term, have been shifted more towards the managed side of trade, where policymakers will look to include things like rules of origin, novel rules of origin, and complicated rules of origin to encourage, investment and production in certain parts of the world, essentially. And so I will leave it at that. Happy to take questions. I think you're still muted, Bruce.
Let's unmute everybody here. Very good. Thank you very much for your, there you go. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you really hit on a lot of points that we were discussing a little earlier, got a little more detail into the regionalization story. I think that was very interesting. One of the questions, and I guess I would say this to the audience, please feel free to enter questions into the Google form that we sent you a link to this morning and also yesterday. And one of the questions that came up for you, Jack, is, do you think the pandemic will accelerate moving manufacturing out of China and back to the US? And if so, what will be some of the long-term effects be on both China and the US?
So I don't think the pandemic is the fundamental driver in the US-China economic relationship or in the manufacturing picture between the US and China, right? I think more and more US companies are coming to understand that the way to serve the market in China is to operate in China or take advantage of some of nascent regional agreements like RCEP, right? And that, US-China trade tensions are not going to be going away anytime soon. And that includes issues like tariffs, and it also includes things like export controls and the other web of emerging regulatory issues that US companies have to deal with doing business in China. So, I think whether or not the coronavirus accelerates a departure of manufacturing from China back to the US is kind of secondary or would track with an already existing trend.
If I might in auto, the Chinese auto market has been slowing in growth, and we've seen increases in wages. So both of those things were a trend before this happened that was leading manufacturing out of China, not necessarily back to the US though. And I'll talk about some of that in my presentation, but we did see, dispersion to other East Asian countries. And then when the tariffs came on, many industries and, for example, tooling, right before the tooling tariffs went on in September, half-built tools were shipped out to South Korea, to Taiwan, to Thailand and other places where they could, and even East Europe, where they could be finished before they came back to the US. So there were trends going on already. I think the tariffs ratcheted that up and accelerated some of those trends. And I agree with Jack that I don't know that the coronavirus, since it's everywhere now, is a particular movement.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one? When I look at the suppliers, the charts that you were showing, Jack, about the amount of imports of Chinese components that come to the U.S., at least in terms, I think you had it in terms of value, it's significant. It's significant. So even though there may be a movement away from China, the numbers really are quite high in terms of the imports of parts, not vehicles.
Yeah, so that's definitely true. I think that was a driving factor behind the administration's approach to the rules of origin in USMCA. I think there was a really large growing concern that, we were building cars in North America and 40% or more of the vehicle was essentially made in China. And, that concept with this administration was not going to fly. I think there was also growing concern that production in Mexico, in particular, that a lot of the value there was also being sourced from China, and so in response, the administration's created really a web of requirements through rules of origin, that are intended, yes, to protect American workers from unfair competition or lower wages in Mexico, for example, but also to protect North America from China's capacity to produce parts. And then, looking forward, I think what the administration is doing on export controls, in particular, and how they're approaching, technology competition with China more broadly, could have implications for trade in components, particular high-tech components, and vehicles in general, as well. So, the more electrified, the more autonomous, and the more connected vehicles become, the more advanced the technology is required in those vehicles, and the more you start to butt up against, really big questions about U.S.-China technology competition and how
Right.
the two countries want to deal with that.
Right. Joe, were you seeing this, the China effects on with your suppliers?
I think that chart is somewhat misleading when you look at it. If you add up the total imports of any type of good that's crossing the border between two major economies such as the United States and China, it's going to look massive. And agreed, there's a big imbalance because we're finishing the product here. And I have some, I'll show a little bit later that, the value of imported goods within the parts that are produced domestically only makes up about 30% of their value. So there's a lot more value added that is being underrepresented in by looking at the trade balance data.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
I think the other point too with China is that a lot of their parts imports are going to aftermarket. So when you go to a Napa auto store, your headlights, your replacement air filters, oil filters, spark plugs, all of that is generally being sourced from low-cost countries like China. And, you know, the part that's going into OE production is much, much smaller than that total volume of parts.
Good point. Good point, Kristen. Yeah. Any percentages on that? Percentages of aftermarket versus OE parts?
We think it's way more than half.
Okay.
That's you can't tell. There is no separate code for parts that are going to retail aftermarket versus to
right.
OE. It's well more than half of the Chinese imports are going to aftermarket, though.
Interesting. Good point. I think we'll take a quick 10-minute break here. Let our viewers take a break as well, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. Thank you very much, guys. Okay, thanks everybody for sticking with us, and I hope you're enjoying the conference. As I said to myself a little bit ago with my microphone turned off, that I've been continuing to learn new things from our discussion. Our next speaker is Christian Dizik from the Center for Automotive Research. She's the Vice President of Industry, Labor, and Economics at CAR. She joined in 2005 and has more than 25 years experience as a researcher and policy analyst. The team that she leads focuses on economic analysis, forecasting and modeling, policy, and economic development. Her research includes analyzing the competitive cost position of the U.S. automotive industry and evaluating how different tax, trade, or industrial policies and incentives could impact overall automotive sales, production, and employment. Prior to joining CAR, Kristen served as the Associate Director of the Michigan Manufacturing Technology Center and has worked for the U.S. Congress, the UAW, and General Motors. She earned her BA in Economics, MPP in Public Policy, and MS in Industrial and Operations Engineering, all from the University of Michigan. Kristen, again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You can share your screen and take it away.
Okay. So you should be seeing this now, yes?
You got it?
Okay, there. Well, you know, thank you for having me. And, you know, I've learned a lot from the first few presentations as well. You know, I want to note that, you know, the auto industry is no stranger to crisis. It seems like we're already in some kind of crisis recently. And the supply chain in particular is, I'm glad I'm not in supply chain management. You know, there's been fires and tornadoes and tsunamis and floods, bankruptcies and insolvencies throughout the supply chain. And the big problem we have is we need all the parts to show up all at the same time to make a car. Most people want a complete set when they go to the dealer to buy a new vehicle. So it's very complex orchestration across the supply chain. And here in the United States, something like 78% of our suppliers are firms that have fewer than 100 people. So we're dependent on a lot of small businesses throughout the United States and a lot of businesses across the world to support our manufacturing. And, you know, one example is, you know, on April 13th, there was a tornado in South Carolina that hit a BorgWarner plant. That BorgWarner plant is tied to Ford production. There was news just at the break that BorgWarner plant is expected to restart in early May, but you know they had a tornado hit their plant April 13th, and now they're turning around and coming back up. Just a few years ago, there was a fire at a magnesium casting supplier in West Michigan that shut down all Ford F-Series pickup truck production in the United States for some period of time. And the F-Series is approximately 9 or 10% of all US vehicle output. So there are tremendous efforts put in place to work around supply chain kinks and bottlenecks and disruptions that are happening all the time. And now we are looking at COVID-19 is a crisis writ large on those supply chain managers and how they're going to work around all of the disruption that they are yet to face. When it first came through, we were looking at, well, what parts are sourced from China and which companies are particularly vulnerable, and you know, how is that going to impact manufacturing here? you know, everybody has some Chinese content. And as I said, you need all the parts. Then it moved to Europe and to Italy first, and that, you know, exposed differentially some of the automakers here in North America, the European producers and FCA, more dependent on Europe sourcing than some of the others, but still we need all the parts. And now it's here in North America, and, you know, Detroit has been an epicenter of the disease outbreak. So, you know, we see things maybe a little differently around here, but the course of the disease in the rest of the country is still to play out. So we will continue to have disruptions from different regions as the disease outbreak spreads. And then the big concern, which I'll talk about in this presentation, is what's going on with Mexico and the Mexico restart. So we really need a synchronized restart, a slow, steady, sustained restart to this industry, because we unwind capital very quickly if we start, stop, start, stop. So that's my introduction to my presentation, but I'm going to get right into, you know, the coronavirus threats are supply chain disruption, the continuing health crisis, especially among the workforce, sharp demand drop from consumers. In April, we were down about 50%. Projections, I'm sorry, in March, in projections for April were much more negative than they are likely may turn out. There was recent information from both JD Power and Cox Automotive that they're projecting April sales to be at a 7.5 million SAR pace. We were at about 11.4 million pace in March. And for level setting, last year was like 16.8, 16.9. So we're, you know, much lower pace of sales, but April is holding up a little better because there are some regions of the country that are, you know, pandemic, what pandemic? And there's great deals right now. 0% financing, 84 months, no payments for 3 months. Hyundai's brought back its job assurance program. So if you have a job and you have money and you wanted to buy a car, there's a lot of good deals out there. And so that's held up our market a little bit better. And one area that I've spent a lot of my time on, and is on the financial impacts. You know, there's a lot of concern about how long can these automakers last. And I know Professor Deerdorf showed some slides about, you know, which automaker had how much money to last how long. You know, there've been a lot of changes since that slide was put together. Most of the automakers have credit facilities, revolving credit facilities that they've been able to tap. You know, the credit market is working now that it wasn't in 2008 and 2009. Ford went to the market for an $8 billion bond and has had takers at that. You know, they're borrowing on a 50-year bond at a fairly high interest rate in order to turn around and offer consumers 0% interest. So, you know, there's a lot of other private capital exercise, as well as pulling back from some of those investments in long-term technology bets, pulling back the dividends, just doing a lot to conserve cash. So the months that they can last, the D3 look like they can last in, you know, more than the 3 months FCA was on the chart for. Ford is saying they can last through the end of the year, and GM is a little stronger, but their balance sheets are a lot stronger now. The real concern I have is the supply chain. Suppliers have been, they get paid on 30 to 60-day terms. So what work they did before the shutdown, they're still getting paid for through mid-May. Once we hit mid-May, their revenue stops. And they have restart capital requirements that they're going to need to get going. So that is what really does us in if we have a start-stop return to production, is that the suppliers start, and if they stop again, then they're getting paid for a little while, but then, you know, those 30 to 60-day terms, and it just really unwinds very quickly. And I'm not going to spend much time on that in this presentation, but the health concerns in the plants as we return are very significant. We did a webinar at the Center for Automotive Research with a couple of leaders at Magna talking through some of the restart playbooks and what's going to be required in redesigning jobs, implementing new safety procedures, having workers wear PPE. If you saw the 60 Minutes piece at about GM and Ford and how they're producing ventilators and personal protective equipment and the procedures they put in to protect the workforce in those realms has been significant. Ford's using a watch, a Samsung watch that shows, will alert you if anybody's within 6 feet of you, and it can also be used for contact tracing. So you know who was in contact with anybody who does come down with the disease. These are all procedures that have been honed in China, in Korea, and other parts of the world where production has restarted. The UAW remains concerned that the safety of their members is protected. And you may have seen several announcements from the president of the UAW asking for not to return in early May and not to return until there was more safety procedures in place and more testing, which is one of the big differences, especially with the South Korean restart. There's just ubiquitous throughout the South Korean populace. There is testing, testing, isolation, and containment of the disease more so than we're seeing here because of the lack of testing. So these are, the ways that we're seeing some threats to the U.S. firms. And consumer demand drop. We don't know what we don't know, and April may be less bad than we thought. But is this a U? Is this an L? Is it a V? Is it a W on the recovery? We're just, we're going to wait to see what's happening there. Motor vehicle sales during economic slowdowns. This is comparing the 2008-2009 slowdown to what we're seeing right now with some projections. In China, the Chinese market was not nearly as large in 2008 and 2009. So they were fairly insulated from the Great Recession. So this is, the play out from the months overlay from those periods. Europe was affected just about as much as we were. And has seen a very strong drop, downward drop in 2020. And then in the US, similarly, we were starting to fall off a little bit earlier and following a fairly similar trajectory to the 2008-2009 slowdown. There's a lot different about this than 2008 and 2009. As I mentioned, credit markets weren't functioning then. We were on a long downward trajectory, especially in the domestic automaker share of the market. There was a lot of capacity in the industry, which there isn't now. So there's a lot of reasons to think that this is not going to play out in much the same way. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about globalization, and excuse me if some of this is elementary for some of you in the auto industry, but I knew we had a broad audience here, so I wanted to cover a number of factors that help us think about the globalization and trade. First is trade is allowing consumers a tremendous amount of choice. We only make 115 models, nameplates of vehicles in the United States. And the F-150 there this is the number one vehicle that we make, almost 9 or 10% of production. But you can go to a dealer and buy 363 different models. Here is the beautiful Ferrari California, of which there were 10 sold last year. So there are some models like the Ford Mustang made here in Michigan. This is the only production place for that vehicle, and it's sold around the world. And so trade allows us to have exports of unique vehicles. It allows us to have a greater choice for consumers. About a third of the vehicles that are sold here, 120 nameplates, have volumes of less than 5,000. So that's not sufficient to support domestic production of those models. So if we retrenched and we made everything in the United States and only bought US built vehicles, we would have a lot fewer vehicles to choose from. It also offers us lower prices. So this is a track of the CPI from the beginning of NAFTA to 2019. And here you see that under NAFTA, since NAFTA took effect, inflation for all items is up 75%. And inflation for new vehicles is up 8.7%. So a very flat line, really, for the new vehicle prices. It's not just because of NAFTA, it's also because of sourcing to China and Eastern Europe and other low-cost countries, and a number of other factors that have led us to have greater content of vehicles at much lower prices. Oftentimes when I show this to people, they say, oh yeah, but the average sticker price is $38,000 now. It just feels a lot more expensive, but everything else we're buying is relatively more expensive. And, a lot of this is due to that integration here in North America and the reliance on nearshoring to Mexico. We cannot self-supply the vehicles that we sell to US consumers. This is the math. We produced 10.7 million vehicles last year. We exported 1.9, we imported 8.3, and we got 17.1 million sales. Of those vehicles sold in the United States, 54% were built in the United States. And of those, 29% were built by US firms. And there I'm counting GM, Ford, FCA, and Tesla. A quarter, 25%, were built by the international firms that operate here in the United States. So Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Subaru, BMW, Daimler, those. When we look to the imports, more than half of our imports, 15% come from Mexico, 9% from Canada, from our NAFTA or USMCA partners, and half of those are coming from the GM, Ford, and Chrysler operations in our neighboring countries. It's important to note that that is not a really new thing. Ford has been continuously producing vehicles in Mexico since 1925. We've had that global reach of this auto industry for a long time, but we've really changed what that global reach means and how it's defined and how we leverage it for efficiencies and greater sustainability of the industry. Our next largest trading partner, Japan, as was covered in previous presentations here, we are working on a trade agreement with Japan. It currently does not, the phase 1 deal does not cover autos. South Korea, they inked the Chorus deal and re-upped it during the Trump administration. So I expect that there's stability in the South Korea-US relationship. And then Germany and the UK and everybody else make up a very small segment of US sales. So it's 7% here. China is in there. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny little wedge. And we do export more vehicles to China than we import. And there are trade agreements going on with basically all of the remaining or trade negotiations with all of the various sources of vehicles. We get parts from all over the world, and we have for a long time. The countries in green, they're the top 35 automotive parts import sources, and they account for 99% of all of our US auto parts imports. Just 4 countries account for 70%: Mexico, Canada, China, and Japan. And Canada and China have traded places in 2019, largely due to the ongoing trade dispute with China. But Canada was 3rd and now it's 2nd. But we are heavily reliant, 50% of our parts imports coming from our neighboring countries here. And so the implementation of USMCA is extremely important to the long-term health of this industry. Anybody remember the World Car? There was a movement and a trend in the 80s talking about the World Car. So before this, we had a lot more regional production and even regional within the United States. There were branch plants. They were, the plant in Van Nuys, California, way back when, made all the models that it needed to make for the California market. We didn't have platforms and logistics to get the vehicles from one plant to the rest of the market. They were more regionalized. So as we moved to a platform strategy, this World Car came about. So the first World Car that I can think of might be the Volkswagen Beetle, made in Germany, but sold all over the world, and pretty homely, as this ad implies. The Corolla, the top selling vehicle in 1974, made only in Japan at that time, but that was considered the year of the small car. And then Ford and the Ford Escort. The Ford Escort was made in multiple places in Europe and in the United States for different markets. They were not the same vehicle, though. The World Car was not the same vehicle, and that has changed dramatically. The current version of the Ford Escort, the Ford Focus, I'm going to talk a little bit about in just a second, is perhaps more of an embodiment of what the World Car was meant to be. I'm taking Ford as an example. I'm picking on you guys from Ford who are on the call, I'm sorry. But take, for example, the Ford truck platform, the T3 platform. They can make 4 different vehicles on that platform. The F-Series pickup trucks at various levels of beefiness, and the Expedition and the Navigator. They make those in 4 plants, all located in the United States. So that supply chain is likely very regional, and very upper Midwest focused even. Because that's a vehicle that, while we do export some, we don't export a lot, mainly for the North American market. Now, if you turn to the small car platform, the C1, which is now the C2, the focus is on that platform, but they also have made the C-Max, the Escort in China, the Escape, the Kuga, the Transit Connect, the Tourneo, the Lincoln MKC, a number of different models on the same platform. They make it in 9 different plants around the world. And when you've got one platform made in 9 different plants around the world, and there is some regional variation, but let's say you wanted to source the windshield wiper motor for this plant. Where are you going to source it from? You might source it from one supplier, and that supplier may have 3 plants around the world. And so those 3 plants around the world are supplying your 9 production locations. So are you going to have a different supply chain for the one that's made in North America, the Ford Escape made in Kentucky, for the vehicles parts that are not differentiable, that the customer is not going to notice, and that, you know, can be built really anywhere. And I think that's the underlying thing of the world car. I think we've, you know, finally evolved to these greater efficiencies in the use of global platforms. And not only that, the companies have gone from a whole wide plethora of platforms to just a handful, as they've gained greater and greater efficiencies in manufacturing. I know that we've seen this chart before, but you know, this is from the Peterson Institute and the ramp up of the US-China trade war and tariffs and how that has escalated over time. So I'll skip over this. But the consequences for the auto industry, and here my red dots amount to the HS codes that were covered in tranche 1 that covered cars and trucks. My blue dots are in tranche 3, which covered most of auto parts trade. And what we're looking at is if it's to the right of the center line, that means there's been an increase in imports from China between 2018 and 2019. And if it's to the left, there's been a decrease north of the center line, the belt line. That means there's been an increase in imports from the rest of the world year over year. And if it's in the bottom left quadrant, that means there's been, or bottom half, it's been, there's been less imports from the rest of the world. So that bottom left quadrant is basically weak demand. The top left quadrant is substitution. So where we're getting things from China, we're now getting it from other places in the rest of the world. And if I showed you all of the countries we did this chart on, the biggest winner here is Mexico, where we've seen a great shift from pieces that were in auto parts that were sourced from China that are now being sourced from Mexico. And these categories that are here cover a vast majority of the trade that we have between the US and China. I won't go into great details, but this is my version of the changes between NAFTA and USMCA. I think, you know, it's important to note that NAFTA really explicitly allowed roll-ups. So there was this tracing list, and there was a set number of parts that were on this tracing list. And if the part that you were producing or using was not on the tracing list, it was called deemed originating. And that meant that you could count that as North American content toward your rules. And now they don't have deemed originating, but they have roll up. And roll up means that if something meets the content rules for its part category, it is then considered 100% conforming for all other purposes of the rules. This change to this more broad categories of parts that are covered modernizes the agreement tremendously. The tracing list had things on it like 8-track tape players and distributor caps and things that aren't in cars anymore. This new rule is much more broad. And as Jack pointed out, you know, there's some very novel requirements here. The aluminum and steel sourcing, the labor value requirements are brand new, and we've not seen those in any other trade agreement. And it also addresses some things outside the trade agreement. So there were provisions that through side letters that Canada and Mexico would have some exemption to any 232 tariffs and some limited protection if we were to raise our MFN tariffs on autos and parts for the rest of the world. So there were, this trade agreement was addressing things outside of the trade agreement itself. These are the content thresholds that they have to get to over the course of 3 years. I think, last week we started to see there was a communication from the U.S. Trade Representative to the House Ways and Means Committee on their progress in implementing. We're aiming for this July 1st implementation date. And as Jack pointed out, the USTR believes that this will be helpful in the COVID-19 crisis as it tries to bring more and more work back to the U.S. But they've set up these interagency committees, both on labor and environment, the labor attaches that they're going to have in Mexico. The USTR has added staff that are focused on the labor enforcement rules. And then they've added a forced labor task force to the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Labor is preparing the LVC, or the Labor Value Content Interim Regulations. They're also working on dispute resolution and the environmental requirements, and then alternative staging. Jack kind of jumped over this a little bit, but there is a provision where automakers can apply for an additional 2 years to comply with these rules, but they have to provide tremendous amount of detail to the USTR about their credible plan to meet the rules over 5 years. And my big concern with that is, lots of things can change in the course of 5 years. So I study labor agreements, and many times the automakers will make a commitment that we're going to make this investment at this plant, and it's going to mean this many jobs. And those investments, that were made in the commitments that were made in the 2007 agreement did not materialize because 2008 and 2009 intervened. Sometimes they make commitments like in 2011, 2015, and they exceed those commitments. But the course of investment and the ability to comply with these rules over the course of 5 years and stick to this alternative staging plan is going to be very dynamic, depending on the underlying economic conditions. They did add some new steel and aluminum rules during the last minute negotiations, where steel has to be melted and poured in North America. Aluminum, they're investigating this, and the big problem there was that Mexico does not have any aluminum smelting. So they were not all on board with having melted and poured as a standard for the aluminum. But overall, the core parts rules, the labor value content rule, incentivize US and Canadian production due to that labor value content rule, the $16 an hour. There are credits toward those the content rules, the 40% for cars and 45% for trucks, and abilities to average within a country to get to that labor value content rule. But I think ultimately it could mean more US and Canadian content in vehicles. Now, let's look a little bit at the post-COVID-19 automotive industry. I really see that there's 3 options, and the 3 options are reshoring. Do we bring things back from the rest of the world to the United States? And that's one. And that's, I think, the hopeful thing that the USTR is thinking about, that USMCA implementation will help bring things back. The other is diversification. Many eggs in many baskets. Do you want to have all of your production dependent on a region that could have a tsunami, a flood, a fire, a epidemic, or a disease outbreak? Or do you want to have many eggs in many baskets? And then the third thing that could happen here is status quo, not a lot of change, because they've already got a fairly resilient supply chain that is global and diversified. And so maybe they think they can manage with what the footprint looks like right now and with very little change. And how will manufacturing change? We mentioned in Jack's presentation, increased automation. Automakers and suppliers, and especially lower down the supply chain, have been talking about the difficulty in getting workers already to work in their plants. And so, increased in automation in the factory is a long-term trend that may accelerate as we bring more manufacturing back. And as Jack mentioned, it sort of negates the low-cost country advantage if you're going to automate processes more broadly. It also, automation does not get sick, can work within 3 feet of each other. They have many different requirements that might make it more possible to continue production in a post-COVID world. And then there's something I'm calling plump lean. We've worked very hard at implementing the lessons from the Toyota production system throughout the auto industry. And maybe we need to plump some things up a little bit, put a little bit more buffer in, put a little bit more in the supermarkets, in the stores, in the supply chain in order to protect. So that's the trade-off that Jack mentioned between resiliency and efficiency. And then consolidation. And I think we're going to see this writ large, largely driven by the financial crises that some of the firms are going to face and the need to make these long-term technology bets that cost a lot of money. So you've seen sort of tie-ups between Ford and Volkswagen. You see GM and Honda co-investing in cruise automation, and electrification and automation in a number of different realms. I think we're going to see more and more of this consolidation of the industry, FCA and PSA tying up to be one of the largest automakers in the world. So those are some of the big changes I think we're going to see in manufacturing. And with that, I'm going to end my friend.
Okay.
And let me take my screen share off.
Yeah, take your screen share off.
Okay, there we go.
Very good. Thank you. We have Alan for a little bit. He has to take off for a meeting. But let's start with a question that has to do with the labor value content. It's going to require full transparency. How successful will the industry be in exposing their full value per part? And will the industry be able to measure the complexity of a LVC?
I think it's going to be very challenging. And I don't know that it essentially requires transparency. So right now, the only data that we have on content is the American Automobile Labeling Act, administered by NHTSA under Part 583. And that is really, really MEDAX. And it's pretty interesting because like the vehicle I drive, a Chevy Equinox, has one line, even though you can get an engine that's made in the US or in Canada, or a transmission that may have been made in China or the US. And so the content for each particular model would change dramatically, but they list one line. The Honda Civic, there are like 12 lines. Is it a 2-door? Is it a hatchback? Is it 4-wheel? All the different variations, and they give a different content rule for each one. NAFTA has requirements for content that are not public. So the data set is entirely kept with the government. So I don't know that it increases transparency to the public. It may increase transparency to the governments that are administering the trade agreement. And yeah, they're going to have to get a lot more data from suppliers that are already really stretched in this COVID-19 environment to build up to their labor value content. Some automakers are going to be able to do it on their own without amassing their supplier data, but some are going to have to go to the supply base, and it's going to be extremely challenging and costly to implement this big change in for a July 1 entry into force.
Alan?
Yeah, I have wondered, especially since a conversation I had with a former student of mine who was for a long time with the AFL-CIO. She's very critical of NAFTA. She told me that she can't imagine that this labor wage requirement is ever going to be really effective because it will be too hard to implement. I don't know if she's right, but I do wonder, however it is handled by the government, somehow the decision has to get to the border where the decision to levy the tariff at the border is being made or communicated, I guess, to the traders. And I mean, I presume that for most things, when you're talking about rules of origin, those who bring about across the products have paperwork that tells about the country of origin. Is that paperwork, if it's handled by the government, who's going to provide that paperwork so that they know whether to levy the tariff or not? Or is the government simply going to tell them these companies are okay, let it through, and these other companies are not? I don't know. It just sounds horrendous to me. And so I am inclined to suspect that it's never going to happen.
Well, I think it's also, I'm going to hesitate to say this definitively, but it's for U.S. and Canadian production, it's a fairly low bar.
Well, yeah, oh yeah, of course.
Because there are credits
Right.
to apply toward it. It essentially is a disqualifier for much of Mexican production. And when we were looking at the first implementation of USMCA, it was about a third of Mexican production was not going to qualify, and they would be disqualified for different parts of the rule, but the labor value content rule was a major portion of why that a third of production was not going to qualify. So automakers have choices. They just, some of those vehicles are some of the smaller, low cost, low margin vehicles that maybe don't sell so well in the United States. So maybe they just pull them from our market and we have less choice. So those 363 nameplates drop down some. And Mexico, as we mentioned earlier, has free trade agreements with a great share of the automotive market in the world, over 50%. Canada and Mexico can both reach 50% of the market for new vehicles without a tariff. So they just focus to non-NAFTA markets, or they trade with with Canada under CPTPP rules, and they can do that because they're both in CPTPP. So there's different outlets for those vehicles that are disqualified from the US market. Plus the tariff on cars is 2.5%. It's pretty low. And, on a small car that may not work, but on some of the CUVs or larger vehicles it could. The only place where I think it's really going to bite is on truck manufacturing, where the tariff is 25%.
So may I follow up on that then? Wait, nobody has talked yet, except you just did now, how much of the trade in North America is just going to go ahead and pay the tariff, in which case none of these rules will matter to them and they might as well source all they want to from China or wherever else. I mean, how much is already happening that's paying the tariff? Do we know?
Yeah, well, if it's non-binding, right, that's saying that the agreement's non-binding. And, I've made this argument before, and I think, over the long term, that's not a sustainable strategy. But in the short term, in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, it very well may be a short-term strategy to get through. And, one of the areas where it's particularly impactful is on electric and electrified vehicles. Those tend to have some of the lowest North American content in them, according to Labeling Act. And, Canada has these incentives to buy more electric vehicles, but most of them, all but one model, is made in the United States or Japan or someplace else. They only make one electric vehicle in Canada themselves. But if they have very, very low content, like 35% or so, are you going to bring that up to 75% for a small market in Canada at a 6.1% tariff? Or are you going to just, sell fewer in Canada? Then we sell virtually no electrified vehicles in Mexico. Built here in the US, sold here in the US. There's no customs border between the Leaf plant in Tennessee and California where they sell them. I don't know what's going to happen to the content of electrified vehicles built in the US for the US market.
Very good. Thank you, Kristen.
I'm going to go let my kid in. If you,
I got one question for you before you go,
okay.
and let your child.
I'll be back on, but I've got to go.
Okay. Has to do with the how much time it will take for the U.S. to get back up to full speed after the pandemic.
Oh, I wish I knew.
Yeah.
I wish I knew. I mean, I think, we're looking at a restart of one shift and a handful of plants across the US and Canada and Mexico. That's, you don't make money unless you're at an 80% capacity utilization or higher. I think we're going to start at 20 or 25% capacity utilization to start off with. And it really depends on that synchronization of the supply chain and the demand and how strong that comes together.
Yeah, very good. All right, thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to be off for just a second and I'll be back.
Okay. Our next speaker, Joe Zazek from the Original Equipment Supplier Association. He's the Research and Industry Analysis Manager. His responsibilities include tracking and analyzing diverse industry and exogenous data sources to create content that supports members' needs. Before joining OESA, Joe was an economics research analyst at Ford Motor Company, specializing in analyzing global economic developments to determine implications for the auto industry. Joe graduated with honors from the U of M Dearborn with a Bachelor in Arts degree in economics and minors in finance and political science. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Bruce.
You can share your screen and take it away.
Sure. Oh, that didn't select. All right, can you see that?
Well, I'm seeing your presentation. I'm seeing two slides.
Hang on one second.
Okay. There you go.
How's that? Okay, great. All right, so thank you very much for having me. So my name is Joe Zazek. I work for the Original Equipment Suppliers Association. We're a trade organization that represents the automotive supply base. We're a sister division of the Motor Equipment Manufacturing Association, which is our parent organization, which has lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. They also do a bit of influencing on a regulatory standpoint as well. So I have a pretty interesting job. I look at a lot of the data sources that my fellow presenters do, monitoring government data, looking at trade data and so on. But I have a really interesting position in that one of the major benefits of having a large member base such as ours is that I'm able to survey our members and really quantify some of the anecdotes that we've been hearing in the news, and that really gives our members a really great opportunity for benchmarking against peer standards, as well as providing some quantifiable data that we can support our efforts in Washington. Skip that slide. So just to touch on the COVID pandemic. So as I mentioned before, I'm able to develop a real-time data set for our members. And what we've really seen since the pandemic spread to the United States is just this overwhelming shutdown of supplier facilities. So in the weeks heading into April 20th, we saw a 64% of our members' U.S. facilities being completely shut down, and a 25% rate that indicated that they'd slowed production significantly. And really, this is just in response to the OEMs announcing their plant shutdowns. And it's really critical for the OEMs to get back up and running. Now, these data were collected before the latest announcement that Alan shared earlier, that the OEMs were going to delay until mid-March. And really, the timeline before that was the beginning of May. I'm sorry, I misspoke. The middle of May is now the new timeline plan for the OEM restart. And this is really critical for the supply base, because as Kristen mentioned before, the suppliers aren't receiving any revenue if they're not production. So their number one priority at the moment is to plan accordingly and get their plants back up and running. So we asked specifically what the biggest challenges were for suppliers as they were planning for restart. And the number 1 and 2 responses were the accuracy of startup times and then the accuracy of their customer release volumes. And overwhelmingly, these stood out as the top concerns. But ironically enough, it was the extension of the shelter-in-place mandate in Michigan that postponed the OEM restart into the middle of May, as opposed to the beginning of May, which I think that was a little bit underrepresented as represented by the results seen here. And then the number 4 concern is the availability of personal protection equipment. We all know that upon restart, everyone wants to maintain their workplace safety. So there's going to be an overwhelming demand for personal protection equipment. And so the supply of those pieces of equipment are a top concern as these plants come back underway. So just an example of that, we've done a lot of work on planning for a safe restart, strategies that our members are going to pursue with returning to a normal work environment. And overwhelmingly, our members say that they're going to be providing masks for all of their employees. Now, there was a 0% response rate saying that no masks were going to be provided for their employees, with a smaller subset just being a little bit indecisive at the moment. And and then we can see like the further breakdown of the type of mask that they're providing, which would be a surgical mask more than anything. So kind of in combination with the ad hoc research that I do, really my focus has been lately, strictly on the COVID pandemic and how to deal with it and how to plan for restart. But my major product is our OESA supplier barometer. And what this is it's a quarterly analysis of both supplier sentiment, threats to the industry, and then we do a deep dive every quarter to investigate, long-term fundamental drivers of the industries. And so these are the results from the first quarter of 2020. And we had a really big rebound in optimism. So we went from a index score of 37 in the fourth quarter of 2019 to a score of 47. And that's just under the neutral territory of 50. And that was really driven by the passage of USMCA. Our member base is really diverse. We have, anywhere from a small mom and pop tooling company that is, pretty limited in exposure to global changes. And, they saw that the passage of USMCA is a really big benefit for their businesses. And it took one of the uncertainties off the table. So like I said, every quarter we ask what the biggest threats to the automotive industry are. And for 8 straight quarters, changes in government trade policy was running at number 1. And then the passage of USMCA dropped it down to number 2, just behind poor sales of vehicles and programs supplied. This is a big change. I mean, the threat of changes in global trade policy was the top concern for my entire career at OESA, and having it subside a little bit was some good news. However, last year in the second quarter, we dove a little bit deeper into what specifically the threats to changes in trade policy were. And the overwhelming response to this question was the proposed Section 232 tariffs on autos and auto parts. and then followed closely by tariffs on steel and aluminum. Now, you can see changes in USMCA policy. I mean, these data were captured way ahead of any passage of the policy or the really the finer details of the policy itself. And that was nearly neutral, as indicated by our members. So the proposal of Section 232 tariffs on other auto parts is really the biggest concern that our members are facing heading into a more normal environment. So if we look at our North American production dynamics, you can see a really in 2019 there was a really expansive increase in the number or the percentage of products that were produced in Mexico. That jumped about 13% from 2018, and that was really taken out of the U.S. And the focus of that over the next, or the change in that over the next 5 years is not expected to decline at all. Mexico is really well positioned, as Kristen mentioned, with the amount of FTAs that they have as an exporter for the rest of the world. But at the same time, there is some expectation that that parts manufacturing will increase in the U.S. And I think that is largely due to the changes in USMCA that we have on the near horizon. So as far as the localization efforts, last year we saw a bit of decline in comparison to 2018 from the OEs and the tier ones to the rest of their supply chain, as that was over communicated in 2018. And now we're really seeing an effort from tier ones and sub-tier suppliers pushing to localize down their supply chain. So when we look at where parts are going, so this is a snapshot of U.S. produced automotive parts and where they're sent. So in 2019, the median percentage of domestically produced products that were exported to anywhere else in the world was only 10%. So what that says is that these parts are being used internally. So they're supporting, OEM facilities and tier one facilities within the United States that ultimately, find their way into vehicles and that are produced, here in the Midwest, down in Texas, and then along the East Coast. But it's pretty interesting to show that there isn't really there was a substantial decrease in the amount of U.S. parts that were sent into Mexico. Primarily, the reason being is that, like I said before, the parts are ultimately used here to support production, and if parts are being if vehicles are being manufactured in Mexico, then they're going to capitalize on that regional structure to support the Mexican OEM facilities. Sorry. So directionally, where we're heading is, the regional plan for U.S. exports is to support the Mexico facilities as there's continued investment from OEs with manufacturing facilities there. To a small degree, sending finished parts to China and Europe, as those are the expected areas for the development of electrified vehicles. And then the rest of Asia being used as a hub to support Chinese production. Now on the import side, like as I mentioned earlier, so only 30% of the dollar value of the content of U.S. produced auto parts is imported from anywhere else in the world, and there's a pretty even matching between China and Mexico, but those numbers are down pretty substantially from the prior year, with the median responses being 23% and 20% respectively. Now, like I mentioned, as suppliers are starting to invest in the rest of Asia to support the production of vehicles within China, they're also able to capitalize on doing business with those suppliers, and also building facilities there to support production here in the U.S. And then Mexico, obviously, we're going to continue to accelerate our reliance on their cheap labor, as they're really closely related. We have a highway system that we're connected directly to. And it really supports a timely, just-in-time type of industry. So one of our focuses is to determine, like I said earlier, the biggest risks to the industry, and overwhelmingly the number one responses are all timing related. So receiving late changes for customer engineering changes, short shipments delay. And this really reiterates the fact that having this regional focus for your supply chain is critical for efficiency. And any type of disruptions within that space that really costs suppliers, and it deteriorates the relationships that they have with their customers at the same time. So when we look at the risks of production, you can see, in a slightly different view, what are your greatest internal risks meeting customer production requirements, and that's short lead times, and then also labor and production issues. From a supply chain aspect, timing is critical. The automotive supply chain is an incredibly dynamic industry, and it operates with incredible speed. So in order to deliver parts at efficient time and an incredibly massive volume, being as quick and responsible as possible is business critical. Now it's really interesting how everything changed so rapidly within the auto industry. I mean, it seems like 3 months ago, I couldn't go to an external presentation anywhere that wasn't 100% allocated towards electrification. The OEMs have done an incredible job of strengthening their commitment to producing really just an incredible change to the industry, where we're going to stop relying on the internal combustion engine, and start relying on a much cleaner energy source. And the supply base is really they're already benefiting from that. So doing new business with companies like Rivian and Tesla, they're really driving innovation from the suppliers, but at the same time, the suppliers are really concerned about volumes. So you can see here the number 2 most responded to answer for this question was the lack of program profitability. Now Tesla's been pretty successful with squeaking out, you know, 1/4 of profitability, but the name of the game in the auto industry is volume. And in order to really capitalize on that, it's just going to be incredibly difficult in the near term with the small amounts of volumes that we expect domestically. But not only that, but you know, around the world at the same time. So when we ask suppliers, you know, what are their expectations for electrification? No one was really optimistic that it was going to happen, you know, anytime soon. So how confident are you that global BEV production will reach a substantial portion within the next 2 years? And overwhelmingly, no one's very confident in that. Within the next 2 to 5 years, a little bit better, but really you know, we didn't break above the level of neutrality until 5 to 10 years out. And that's really interesting considering the amount of money that OEMs as well as suppliers have been investing into this. It's just an incredibly long payoff period. And this COVID crisis, you know, it couldn't have come at a worse time. You know, we're you know, heading towards a big technological transition within the automotive industry, and this issue is just going to push everything out, you know, in my opinion, you know, years into the future. From a regional perspective, no one expected that BEV production was going to happen, you know, be led by North America, with a weighted average forecast of 8.9 years in order to reach 10% of total production. I mean, at 17 million units of sales, that's 1.7 million units. I mean, you know, you can only divide that by so many models in order to have everyone, you know, making a profit at that point. And then, you know, Europe and China have had some, you know, regulatory pushes that are, you know, really going to drive that innovation locally there. But I would expect the you know, the prior presenter's point was that, you know, the regionalization within those industry or within those you know, epicenters of automotive sales, that the investment from the supply base is going to happen to the outlying countries. So in Europe, in being supported by Middle East and Africa, the underdeveloped countries like Turkey and the former Soviet states, and then China really, you know, being supported by the ASEAN countries, Thailand, so on and so forth. And then, you know, just to simplify everything, there's you know, we just asked, you know, where do you believe, you know, 10% level of total production and electrification will first occur? And overwhelmingly, the response was China, a small subset in North America, and then probably a reflection of some of our European members that it was going to first occur in Europe. So with that, I'll open it up for Q&A. Oh, Bruce, you're still muted.
And Kristen is unmuted as well.
Okay, everybody is now unmuted. Thanks very much for your presentation, Joe. You really gave us some nice insight into what your supplier groups are thinking. When you think about what you're seeing from your supply base, what do you think is going to be the major changes that you see happening probably over the next 2 to 3 years in supply chains?
In regards to trade or technological development?
It could be, let's talk about
probably either like supply chain management, sourcing decisions within your supply base.
Right. Well, you know, the changes in USMCA really threw a you know, a curveball at the suppliers. You know, Kristen mentioned the challenges that they face as far as you know, accounting for the labor value content, which makes, you know, the issue even more incredibly complex. But at the same time, I think that there's a really big opportunity for your core components producers to provide value to the OEs by producing modules and big ticket items domestically that allow their vehicles to be, you know, qualified for preference, lack of tariffs on anything, and not have to pay any type of a tax on production, so to speak.
Kristen, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Well, I think, you know, you can go back to the hearings for the 232 tariffs. You know, there was nobody in the industry who was really supportive of 232 other than perhaps the UAW. The UAW's testimony at that hearing like 2 years ago in July talked about the parts of the supply chain that have not yet fully matured, things that are related to electrification, automation, you know, the sensors and cameras and all of that stuff, where we're not broadly just deploying those across the current manufacturing base, but that, you know, it wasn't a move to bring back air filters and oil filters. It was, you know, how can we capture more of the high value content that's going on to the modernized vehicle? And, you know, that we don't have LiDAR puck manufacturing at scale. So what are the incentives that we need to do to make that happen here? I think even if wherever it happens, it's going to be more automated than it otherwise would have been. So, you know, we're bringing back some jobs, but there's a limit to that.
Yeah. Joe, do you expect more dual sourcing coming because of the pandemic or the trade agreements?
You know, you know, within the supply community, I mean, we're really at the mercy of the OEMs. I mean, you know, that's an interesting aspect. I mean, our members have, you know, really emphasized the point that as long as the OEs are committed to returning to production in a timely manner, that they'll have no issue, you know, getting back up and running and, you know, providing the appropriate volume to support that vehicle production. But as you know, as Kristen pointed out, you know, with the fire on the west side of the state, I mean, you know, that's Ford's golden ticket, so to speak. The F-150, I mean, that's their breadwinner. And, you know, having a single source item like that can completely shut down your line is, you know, it just opens up another opportunity for risk. And I would anticipate, possibly an increase in dual sourcing, but, you know, as everyone else has pointed out, you know, the entire world is experiencing the COVID pandemic. So I doubt that, you know, the pandemic itself would really accelerate that type of strategy.
Well, I think, you know, the other interesting part about the fire in West Michigan at the magnesium casting plant was that there just isn't that much magnesium casting capacity in the world. As we've moved to lightweighting, you know, there's been this like catching up of the supply chain's ability to do these, you know, hot stamping and casting of magnesium and other metals that we're using that, you know, we used to be primarily steel. So lots of steel casting, not a lot of magnesium casting. So the workaround for that was to charter the largest plane in the world, get those dies that were not damaged, luckily, on a plane to England, where there was some magnesium casting capacity, and ship parts back from England for a short period of time until they could rebuild in West Michigan. So that's not cheap
No.
But and they certainly may have dual sourced that part if there was capacity in North America. Otherwise, all of the magnesium casting capacity in North America was full
Yeah.
when they went to look for where they could source those parts in the short term.
I think it's those kinds of examples that really bring home the complexity of the industry and also the resilience of the industry and and how much money they are willing to spend to make things happen when they need to make them happen. Kristen, I have a question for you. Do you have any sense of what percentage of parts are dual sourced by the manufacturers?
I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah, it's a
And then there's
tricky
dual
one.
sourcing
And
even
I'm sure
within.
it could-
There's even dual sourcing within one supplier too. A supplier may have, like I said, 3 or 4 different locations around the world, and there's been some of that to get around the China tariffs. Is that we were sourcing this from China for U.S. production, and now we're going to reroute our Taiwan production to China, and so just moving things around within larger suppliers that do have a global footprint, just shifting which factory serving which market.
Right. And I think we've seen it in the past, in particular with the Japanese suppliers. They go, yes, we dual source. We have a plant in the U.S. and we have a plant in Japan. that becomes their form of dual sourcing. I guess I want to end it today with one question for both of you, and it's a pandemic question. How do you see the pandemic changing the industry that we know today, if at all?
I think
I covered
the
that in the end of
immediate
my presentation. Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Joe, let's go to you first.
I would really echo, what Kristen said about, expecting some consolidation. I mean, there's a lot of cash-rich firms that are out there right now, and there's going to be a lot of smaller firms and even some big ones. They're really going to run into some solvency issues, and it's going to, really open up some opportunities for M&A and consolidation.
Yeah, good point. Kristen, you said you said some
Yeah.
things in your presentation about this.
Right, and I think to echo Joe, the consolidation is not only based on the solvency or insolvency of the companies, but the big technology bets that they have to make. So we may see things short of M&A, but more partnerships, more joint ventures, more activity where they're leveraging each other's ability to put the cash out on these longer term technology bets that are immense. I think greater automation, fatter lean, and consolidation are my 3 trends coming out of post-COVID. And one more that I just remembered is probably continuing to manufacture medical PPE for a little while, because they're going to need it for production, not just to support
Exactly.
the medical industry, but we need the PPE in the plants.
I know it'll be intense. It's going to be intense with thousands and thousands of workers. Especially if they're only one use. If things are only you use them one time, then you're talking about every day you're swapping it out. It's a tremendous amount of effort and product from the PPE
or
side.
several times a shift.
Very
even
good. Thank you.
It could be several times a shift. It's very hot
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, locally.
Well, thank you very much,
The hospital.
Joe and Kristen. I want to thank you both
Thank
for participating. Great presentations. Also want to thank our audience for sticking with us, and also our affiliates for supporting the conferences. And we'll see everyone hopefully again in July for our Powertrain Strategies for the 21st Century conference. I think we're going to be looking at some of the issues related to the tipping points for electric vehicles. So please feel free to join us. Thanks again, Kristen and Joe, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.